Ezra Donovan didn't buy a gold mine. He bought a grave. The year was 1887. The Arizona sun didn't just shine. It cooked the hope right out of you, leaving a man dry and brittle as a dead cicada. Ezra knew. He felt it in the grit fused deep under his fingernails, in the permanent curve of his spine. A quiet, so loud it screamed, had moved into his soul 2 years back, right after the fever took his wife, Martha, and their little boy. He was a prospector, but all he ever found in the dirt was his own hollow-eyed reflection. Every pan came up empty, a perfect mirror for the gaping hole in his chest where his family used to be. He drifted south, a ghost chasing his own ghosts, until he washed up in Purgatory Flats. The name fit. In a fog of cheap whiskey and last-ditch desperation, he gambled what little he had left. At a dusty auction outside the saloon, he saw a map tacked to a sun-blasted board. He bought a mine. Not a good one. A cursed one. They called it the Serpent's Tooth, abandoned for a decade, famous for yielding nothing but broken men and shattered dreams. It was cheap. So cheap the auctioneer actually laughed when the gavel fell. Ezra didn't care about gold. He was buying a final, quiet place to fail, a place to be swallowed by the earth, a tomb. The journey took 3 days. The world grew emptier with every mile, the saguaros standing guard over a land that had forgotten mercy. The heat wasn't weather. It was a weight pushing him down. He finally found it, a jagged shadow gouged into the side of a low, dusty mesa. A gaping mouth. The air that breathed out of it was cool, smelling of damp earth and something older, something still. This was it, the end of the line. He felt no pride, no hope, just the tired relief of arrival. He tied his mule, Beatrice, to a skeletal ironwood tree, lit a lantern, and stepped from the blinding sun into the waiting dark. He wasn't looking for a glint of silver. He was just looking for a place to unroll his bedroll and let the world fade away. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, carved by hands long gone. The lantern light chased the shadows back, painting the rock walls in shades of flickering amber. And then the light caught something that wasn't rock. Ezra froze. His breath hitched. His heart slammed against his ribs. Huddled in the far corner were 3 people. 3 native women, their faces frozen masks in the sudden glare. An old woman sat against the wall, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes holding a weariness that made his own look childish. Beside her, a younger woman, the daughter, had thrown herself in front of a small girl. Her jaw was set like granite, her eyes burned with a protective fire, a fire he hadn't seen since Martha held their son. The little girl, no more than 6, peered around her mother's leg, her eyes a mix of pure terror and solemn curiosity. For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the slow drip, drip, drip of water from somewhere deeper in the mine and the frantic, wild hammering of Ezra's own heart. His mind was slow, stunned, like a man just pulled from a frozen river. This was his mine. His property. He had the deed. These people. They were trespassers. The word was cold and sharp in his head. Legal. But it felt insane, looking at the 3 pairs of eyes locked on him. He had bought this place for his silence, his solitude, and instead he'd found it filled with the exact kind of desperate, clinging life he was trying to forget. His first feeling was anger, a hot, white flash. He opened his mouth to shout, to order them out, to take back this one last, pathetic piece of the world that was his. But the words turned to ash on his tongue. He saw their frayed buckskin clothes. He saw a woven basket with a few miserable-looking roots inside. He saw the way the mother's hand rested on the child's shoulder, a gesture that said, "I will die before you touch her." He didn't see intruders. He saw refugees. He saw a story of loss that echoed in the empty caverns of his own chest. He lowered the lantern. He was a man who had lost everything. He couldn't be the reason someone else lost the last thing they had. He'd come looking for a tomb. He'd found a sanctuary. And he, the owner, was the invader. The standoff stretched, thick and heavy. The mother, Alawa, didn't move an inch, her body a living shield for her daughter, Kia. Her eyes never left Ezra. She saw exactly what she expected. A white man, stinking of dust and sadness, holding a lantern like it was a gun. He was the face of the world that had burned her village, scattered her people, and taken her husband in a skirmish months ago. All she had left was her mother, the elder Ha-O-Zin, and her child. She would fight him with her bare hands before she let him take them. Ezra saw the hate in her eyes. It was clean and sharp as a fresh-chipped arrowhead, and he understood it. He cleared his throat. The sound was a cannon blast in the small cave. This is my claim," he croaked, his voice rough from not being used. The words were pointless. He knew they didn't speak his language, and even if they did, the paper in his saddlebag meant nothing here. The only law in this cave was the one burning in Alawa's eyes, the law of a mother protecting her own. He did the only thing he could. He backed away, slowly, out of the chamber, out of the mind's mouth and back into the blinding, unforgiving sun. He felt dizzy. His world had just been turned upside down. He stood there for what felt like an hour, listening to the buzz of flies and the shuffle of his mule. The anger was gone. In its place was a deep, unsettling confusion. The law said this place was his. But his gut told him he was the one who didn't belong. He sank onto a rock and buried his face in his calloused hands. His simple plan to just fade away had just become impossibly horribly complicated. He could ride to town, get the sheriff. They'd be removed, sent to a reservation, or worse. The thought made him sick. He'd seen the reservations. They weren't places to live. They were places to wait for death. That night, he made his camp 100 feet from the entrance. He built a small fire, more for the company than the warmth. He could feel them in there, watching, waiting. He ate his beans and hardtack, but it all tasted like dust. He wasn't alone in his misery anymore, and it wasn't a comfort. It was a weight, a responsibility he never, ever wanted. Inside the mine, Ha-O-Zin coughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to shake the very rock around them. Alawa held a water skin to her mother's lips. The old woman was fading. The damp chill of the mine was stealing the last of her breath. "He is still there," Alawa whispered in Apache. Ha-O-Zin's eyes, though cloudy with sickness, were still sharp. "His spirit is broken," she murmured, her voice a dry whisper. "Like a bird with a wing shot off. He brings no violence." She looked toward the faint flicker of his fire. "We wait. The land will decide." But the land wasn't the only thing watching. As Ezra stared into the flames, he thought he saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the light. A coyote, maybe. He dismissed it, but a cold feeling crawled up his spine. He wasn't just being watched by the family in the cave. Something else was out there in the dark. The days fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Ezra would wake up and start his pointless work, chipping at rocks, sifting dirt, the motions of a prospector, but his heart wasn't in it. He was just killing time. He never went back into the mine. But every morning, he'd leave a piece of jerky and a little water on a flat rock near the entrance. By evening, it was always gone. It was their only conversation, a silent admission that they were all in this together, hanging on by a thread. He'd catch glimpses of them, the little girl, Kia, darting out to grab a piece of firewood, the mother, Alawa, a silhouette at dusk, watching him. They were ghosts at the edge of his life. The silence between them was a canyon, wide and deep. But in that silence, he started to see. He saw their strength. He heard the old woman's cough getting worse on the night wind, and he felt a pang of something he thought was long dead inside him. Sympathy. Then one afternoon, the desert decided to remind him who was in charge. He was working on a rock face a little ways up the hill when his footing just vanished. He tumbled down a slope of loose rock, his leg twisting under him in a way a leg should never twist. A hot, searing pain shot up from his ankle. He screamed. The sound was swallowed by the empty land. He tried to stand, and the world went gray with nausea. The ankle was broken. Badly. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the pain. He was miles from anyone. No one on earth knew where he was. He was alone, injured, and his water was running low. He started to drag himself back to his camp. The few hundred yards took him nearly an hour. By the time he got there, he was shaking with shock, his leg swollen to twice its size. He collapsed by his cold fire pit, the pain a relentless, pounding drum beat counting down his final hours. The sun started to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in quiet peace, but in a slow, agonizing death. He closed his eyes. A bitter laugh caught in his throat. He'd bought his grave, all right, and it was ready to claim him. He must have passed out, because when he opened his eyes, a shadow was falling over him. It was Alawa. She stood there, her face impossible to read in the dying light. She looked at his swollen, mangled ankle. Then she looked at his face. For a long moment, she just stood there, a statue carved from stone. Ezra braced himself. He expected her to turn and walk away. Why wouldn't she? He was the enemy, the man who owned her hiding place. His death would solve all her problems. He was a threat, and soon he would be a corpse. Her problems would be over. But she didn't walk away. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she knelt. Her movements were quick, efficient. She didn't say a word. She just pointed at his leg. A question. Ezra, too broken to do anything else, managed a weak nod. She vanished back into the mine. A moment later she returned, but she wasn't alone. Ha-O-Zin was with her, leaning heavily on her daughter. The old woman's breathing was a painful rasp, but her eyes were clear, focused. She examined his ankle with hands that were surprisingly gentle. She murmured something in Apache. Alawa disappeared again, coming back with 2 straight branches and some strips of buckskin. They worked together. They made a splint, crude, but strong. Their touch wasn't kind. It was practical. There was no sympathy in it, just a competence that came from a life of hardship. As Alawa tightened the last strip, Ezra met her eyes. The fire was still there, but underneath it was something new, a grudging respect. A dead man would bring the sheriff, maybe soldiers. A living enemy was a problem they already knew. This wasn't an act of mercy. It was an act of survival. But for Ezra, lying helpless on the cold ground, it felt like grace. Then the old woman did something strange. Before she turned to leave, her eyes darted to the darkness beyond his campfire, a flicker of what looked like fear in her gaze. She murmured a single word to Alawa, a word that sounded like a warning. They weren't just saving him for their own sake. They were saving him because they were all in danger from something else entirely. For days, Ezra was a prisoner. He lay on his bedroll, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. The women cared for him. It was detached, efficient. They brought him water. Alawa even figured out how to brew his bitter coffee, leaving a cup for him without a word. Ha-O-Zin, despite her own sickness, checked his leg every day. She made a poultice from crushed leaves and a dark, strange-smelling mud she brought from deep inside the mine. It was cool and soothing against his hot skin, and the swelling started to go down faster than it should have. And then there was the girl, Kia. She watched him from a distance, her dark eyes filled with a seriousness no child should have. One afternoon, he saw her scratching in the dirt with a stick. She was drawing. She was drawing his mule, Beatrice, and it was surprisingly good. The image hit Ezra like a physical blow. A memory flashed behind his eyes, his own son, Thomas, drawing lopsided stick horses in the dust outside their cabin. The grief was so sharp, so sudden, it ripped a sound from his throat. A choked sob. Kia froze. Her eyes went wide. She saw the tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. And for the first time, the fear in her face was replaced by something else. Empathy. She looked at her drawing, then back at him. Slowly, hesitantly, she walked over and laid the drawing stick down beside his hand. Then she scrambled back to the safety of the mine. It was just a stick, but it cracked him wide open. The hard shell he'd built around his heart for 2 years finally fractured. That night, he spent an hour carving a piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife. He shaped it into a rough little bird. The next morning, when he left the daily offering of food on the rock, he placed the wooden bird next to it. Later, he saw Kia creep out. She snatched up the bird, her eyes bright with a wonder he thought the world had beaten out of her. Then she was gone, back into the dark. The splint, the strange mud, the shared water, the wooden bird. These were the first words they spoke to each other. The canyon between them was still there, but now there was a bridge. A thin, fragile one, but it was a start. Alawa's face began to soften. The hard mask of hate was replaced by a weary watchfulness. One evening, Hao-Zin sat by the fire, her breathing more ragged than ever. She pointed a trembling finger at herself. "Hao-Zin," she whispered. Then she pointed to her daughter. "Alawa," and to the girl clutching the wooden bird. "Kia." Her eyes rested on Ezra, waiting. He understood. He pointed to his own chest. "Ezra," he said. The name felt strange on his tongue. He hadn't said it out loud in months. It was a beginning. Names gave them shape. They were no longer just trespassers and an owner. They were people. The lines blurred. Ezra, now able to hobble on a crutch, started gathering extra firewood for their pile. Alawa would sometimes leave a bowl of savory root stew next to his beans. They started eating together, the fire between them, the silence no longer suspicious, but comfortable. He learned Hao-Zin's cough was an old sickness. He learned Alawa could weave baskets with incredible skill. He learned Kia's solemn face could break into silent, beautiful laughter when Beatrice the mule nuzzled her hand. He didn't just see a family. He saw the last embers of a proud people, refusing to be extinguished. And they started to see him, too. They saw the pain in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. They saw the deep, unending loss. They saw his brokenness, and in it, they recognized their own. They were all just survivors, but the fragile piece they had built was a soap bubble, and it was about to pop. One crisp afternoon, the sound came. The clatter of hooves on rock, the ugly sound of men laughing. A cold dread washed over Ezra. Alawa was at his side in a flash, her face pale, pulling Kia behind her. The shield was back up. 3 riders crested the rise. The man in the lead was big, with a smug, fleshy face Ezra knew all too well. Garrett Vance, the land agent from the auction. He was flanked by 2 rough-looking men with rifles. "Well, well, Donovan," Vance called out, his voice greasy. His eyes slid past Ezra, lingering on the women hiding by the mine entrance. "Looks like you found more than just rocks up here. Heard whispers old Chief Nahil's family vanished into these hills. Heard they were sitting on his silver." Ezra's blood went cold. This wasn't about his claim. It was about a rumor, about greed. He moved, putting himself more fully in front of the mine, his bad legs screaming in protest. "There's no silver here, Vance," Ezra said, his voice low. "And these people are under my protection. This is my property. Leave." Vance laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your property?" You bought a worthless hole in the ground, Donovan. The real prize, he said, nodding at the women, is right there. Now stand aside, and I might cut you in, or you can be a fool. He patted the rifle in his scabbard. The threat hung in the air. Ezra looked from Vance's greedy face to Alawa's terrified one. In that single moment, everything changed. The weariness that had been his companion for 2 years burned away. It was replaced by a clean, hot fire. These women, these strangers, had shown him more kindness than he'd seen in years. They had mended his body, and in their own quiet way, they had started to mend his soul. He had come here to die. But now, standing between this helpless family and this pack of wolves, he had finally found something to live for. I said, "Leave," Ezra repeated. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than all of Vance's bluster. He reached down and picked up a heavy pickaxe. His knuckles were white. He was one man, crippled and outgunned. But he wasn't broken anymore. Vance's smirk died, replaced by an ugly sneer. "Have it your way, Prospector." He looked at his men. "We'll be back. Tomorrow, and we won't ask so nicely." He spun his horse around and rode off, his men following, their laughter echoing back like a curse. The dust settled, and the silence that fell was more terrifying than the shouting had been. Kia was crying, her face buried in her mother's dress. Alawa's face was chalk white. The old fear was back in her eyes, sharper than ever. She looked at Ezra, and he saw a terrible despair dawning in her gaze. He had tried to protect them, but all he had done was make them a target. He had painted a bullseye right on their backs, and he had no idea that Vance wasn't just after some mythical silver. He was after something much, much darker. Something his own father had lost in this very mine, years ago. That night, they huddled together around a single low fire. The pretense of separate camps was gone. They were one unit now, bound by a common threat. The vast, starry sky seemed to press down on them, suffocating. Haozin spoke for a long time in Apache, her voice weak but firm. Alawa translated for Ezra, her English halting. "He seeks the shining stone," she said. "It is a story, a legend. My husband's people, they did not hide silver here." She paused. "They protected this place. This mountain," she gestured to the rock all around them, "is a place of spirits, a place for birthing and for dying. The treasure is not in the ground. The treasure is the ground." It finally clicked for Ezra. They weren't squatters hiding from the world. They were guardians. They were protecting their most sacred place from men like Vance, who would tear it apart for something that was never even there. "We have to run," Ezra said, the words tasting like ash. "We can't stay." Alawa shook her head, a spark of the old fire returning to her eyes. "My mother cannot travel. Kia is too small. They would catch us in the open." A heavy, grim silence fell over them. They were trapped, boxed in. Ezra's eyes fell on the pickaxe still leaning against a rock. Then he looked at the dark maw of the mine. He'd been a prospector for 20 years. He knew rock, he knew timbers and supports, he knew leverage, and he knew desperation. And in that desperation, a wild, impossible idea began to form. It was a fool's plan, a 1-in-a-million shot, but it was all they had. "No," he said softly, looking from Alawa to Haozin. "We won't run. We'll make our stand right here." They worked all night. The moon was their only light. Language didn't matter anymore. Their shared goal was the only language they needed. Ezra, with his miner's knowledge, was their general. He pointed out the key support timbers at the mine's entrance. He showed Alawa which ones to weaken, how to chip away at the rock face above the entrance to create a hanging, precarious ledge of stone. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy, fueled by fear. They piled loose rock, building the foundation for a rock slide. Kia, seeing her mother's fierce determination, helped carry small stones, her little face a mask of solemn resolve. Ha-O-Zin, too frail to work, sat nearby, chanting a low, steady prayer into the darkness. It was back-breaking work. Their hands were raw, their muscles screaming, but they didn't stop. By dawn, they were done. Exhausted, covered in filth, but ready. A single, massive timber, balanced on a knife's edge, held the entire trap together. Tied to it was a rope they had made from braided leather and strips of Ezra's blanket. One good pull would bring tons of rock crashing down. They retreated deep into the mine, to the chamber where he had first found them. And they waited. The darkness was total. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the slow, steady drip of water somewhere in the black. A clock, ticking down to their salvation or their doom. Vance came back just after sunrise as promised. He'd brought 4 men this time. They rode up with an arrogant swagger, their rifles held easy. "Donovan!" Vance bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Last chance! Send out the squaws!" Silence. "Fools!" Vance snarled. He swung down from his horse. "We'll drag 'em out ourselves." He gestured to 2 of his men, and the 3 of them started walking toward the mine. Inside, Ezra's heart was a drum against his ribs. He gripped the rope, his palms slick with sweat. Alawa stood beside him, holding a heavy rock as a weapon, her knuckles white. Kia hid behind her grandmother. This was it. They heard the crunch of boots on gravel. They heard Vance's voice as he and his men stepped under the overhang, into the mouth of the tunnel. "Dark as pitch in here," one of them grumbled. "Light a torch." "Now," Ezra whispered. He and Alawa threw their entire weight onto the rope. For a heart-stopping second, it felt like nothing was happening. Then came a sound like the world splitting in 2. A deep, groaning crack as the main timber splintered. Outside, a man's shout of alarm was cut short by a deafening, grinding roar. The whole rock face they had weakened collapsed. Tons of rock and dirt thundered down, completely sealing the entrance to the mine in a choking cloud of dust. The chamber was plunged into a blackness so profound it felt solid. The roar faded, replaced by the tinkle of a few falling pebbles. Then, a ringing, absolute silence. From the other side of the rockfall, they heard muffled shouts of panic from the men who had stayed outside. They had done it. They had trapped Vance and his 2 men, but in doing so, they had just buried themselves alive. The minutes stretched out, each one an hour long. They were entombed. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Kia started coughing, a small, frightened sound in the suffocating dark. Ha-O-Zin held her close, murmuring softly. The first wave of relief was gone, replaced by a new, creeping terror. They had traded one threat for another. A quick death for a slow one. Then, a sound, a muffled, desperate pounding from the other side of the rubble. "Help!" It was Vance's voice, thin and terrified. "Get us out! I'm trapped!" A grim smile touched Ezra's lips, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He had saved them from Vance, only to condemn them all to a slow, suffocating end in the dark. The despair that washed over him was blacker than the mine itself. He had failed. But then, Ha-O-Zin spoke. Her voice was surprisingly strong. Alawa fumbled for their last lantern, and with a scratch and a flare, a tiny flame pushed back the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was hope. The old woman wasn't looking toward the blocked entrance. She was pointing deeper into the mine, down a narrow, dark passage that Ezra had assumed was a dead end. "There is another way," Alawa translated, her voice trembling. "The way of the spirits. A wind cave. My people have known of it for generations." Ezra stared at the dark opening. All this time, they hadn't been trapped at all. They had a back door. Holding the lantern high, he followed them. Ha-O-Zin, leaning on her daughter, led them down the narrow passage. The air grew cooler, fresher. Soon they could feel a faint breeze on their faces. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast, natural cavern. It was beautiful. Strange rock formations glittered like jewels in the lantern light, and on the far side of the massive chamber, he saw it. A thin sliver of impossible, brilliant daylight. It was a narrow crack in the rock, a hidden exit on the other side of the mesa, completely invisible from the outside. They scrambled through it, emerging into the bright sun, blinking like creatures born into a new world. The air had never tasted so sweet. The sky had never been so blue. They were free. Far below, they could hear the remaining men shouting and trying to dig through the tons of rock at the main entrance. Their voices were faint, desperate. They would never find Vance in time. They didn't look back. Ezra left his mule, his tools, his worthless deed. He left the last pieces of his old life buried in the dust. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a single water skin, and the little wooden bird Kia clutched in her hand. Hao Xin, though frail, seemed to find a new strength from the sun on her face. She pointed a bony finger toward a distant range of purple mountains. "There," Alawa said, her voice filled with a hope Ezra hadn't heard before. "A hidden valley. A place where we can be safe." Ezra looked at this strange, new family he had found. Hao Xin, the keeper of their secrets. Alawa, their unbreakable shield. Kia, their future. He was no longer a prospector hunting for rocks. He was a man who had been buried and then reborn. He had stumbled into a sanctuary to die, and in defending it, he had found a reason to live. The journey ahead was long. The desert was wide and dangerous. But for the first time in 2 long years, Ezra Donovan was not walking alone. He had lost one family to the cruelty of the world, but here, in the most desolate corner of it, against all odds, he had found another. The land ahead was empty, but his heart, for the first time in a very long time, was full. This story shows how even in the darkest of places, a little bit of humanity can change everything. What do you think would have happened if Ezra had ridden back for the sheriff at the beginning? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.